Thanks very much. So let's not lose time because I have many things to say. Let's go on. Now I want to raise the question, am I correct in my reading of Buddhism? As I will now condense the text that you were given to get an idea what I'm aiming at. In the last decades, critics of my reading of Buddhism abound. Representative of these critics are Adrian, I hope I pronounce it correctly in the Slavic way, because Ivakiv's Nagarjuna and Ecophilosophy, and then, not on me, but more generally, John Clark on being none with nature, Nagarjuna and the ecology of emptiness. Ivakiv nicely begins with presenting the core Buddhist concept of dependent origination. The idea is that every identity is process relational position, which means that, say, a tree's existence as a unitary object as opposed to a collection of cells is conventional. Removing the properties of a tree leaves no core bearer behind. The thing we call a tree is empty of inherent self-existence. Its essence is nothing other than the properties and its conditions of self-manifesting. End of quote. This goes against Graham Harman's, the new objectivist, and others' argument that there is something more to any object than its properties, relations, and conditions. For Buddhism, there is nothing, no thing left over. And then another quote, but that is not to say that there is in fact nothing. There is the process relational flux of what John Clark calls nature-naturing, the continuum coming into existence and passing away of the experiential bits of the world, all of which is quite real. So what this implies is that the negative or deconstructive project that Nagarjuna, the great Mahayana classic, is best known for, goes hand in hand with an affirmative, reality-based project of the sort that in current continental philosophy is best represented by Gilles Deleuze. Or, to quote Clark, for Buddhism, the negative path of the destruction of illusion is inseparably linked to the positive path of an open, awakened, compassionate response to a living, non-objectifiable reality, the nature that is no nature. End of quote. But this brings us, I think, to what I see as the central challenge for Buddhism. How do we, humans, get caught into a dream world of illusory, deceptively permanent objects and egos, and the futile quest to defend the ego and dominate reality? Is it enough to say that this is a fundamental human predicament, that is to say, a trans-historical invariant? John Clark makes here, I find this quite interesting, a surprising move into, let's call it a Marxist direction. A quote from John Clark, where most analysis, including most Buddhist analysis of egocentric consciousness and the egoic flight from the trauma of lack, stopped short is in failing to investigate the social and historical roots of this phenomena. we must understand that the ego is not only a psychological and epistemological construct, but also a historical one. Its roots are to be found in the development of large-scale agrarian society and regimented labor, the rise of the state and ancient despotism, the emergence of economic class and acquisitive values, the triumph of patriarchy and warrior mentality. In short, in the evolution of the ancient system of social domination and the domination of nature. To put it in Buddhist terms, our true karmic burden, both personally and collectively, is our profound historicity and our deep materiality. End of quote. But the question remains here, I think, how far can we go in this direction of historicizing, where individuals in pre-class societies dwelling in a living, non-objectifiable reality, the nature that is no nature, and so should the possible post-capitalist society also be conceived as a liberation from the so-called wheel of desire. Another question lurks beneath this one. Why should the destruction of illusion lead to compassion rather than to cynicism, as it often seems to in everyday life, or to social conservatism, as it has in the case of human and other forms of philosophical skepticism? That's, I think, the key question. I think that in spite of all desperate attempts to demonstrate that the way to Buddhist enlightenment goes through modesty and compassion, the only honest answer, I think, is that of Daisetsu Taitaro Suzuki, the great popularizer of Buddhism. For him, Zen is a technique of meditation which is compatible with any political orientation, liberalism, fascism, communism, whatever. This brings us back to the Buddhist critique of my work. For Ivakiv, this is the point where Buddhism meets psychoanalysis. Quote, the key difference between Freud, Lacan, Zizek, I don't deserve this, he put me in this triad, and Nagarjuna is that the former presupposes that the rise of dominating ego is unavoidable. The best we can do is to come to terms with the ego process and try not to get too caught up in the delusional tricks it plays on us. End of quote. This is why my work for Ivakiv totally ignores, quote, the real potential of actually reading Western Buddhism, not just in the light of Lacan, but in the light of the teachings of the Buddha and their lineage. This real potential is, of course, as we have already seen, the affirmation of the flux of positive life. Ivakiv introduces here, quotes a long quote from Suzuki, and he begins it ironically with this note. Suzuki, whom Zizek has probably never read, a trained Zen Buddhist, as well as a professor of Buddhist philosophy and delightfully fluent writer and speaker of English, echoes Vajjiya when he writes about Zen as an absolute life affirmation. Incidentally, not only did I read Suzuki, I wrote extensively on him, on his extreme militarism. Suzuki, I've spoken about this place years ago. Suzuki totally legitimized Japanese militarism, claiming only a warrior who went through the experience of nirvana can function as a perfect killing machine, literally. But let's drop that. Here is a quote of from Suzuki. We live in affirmation and not in negation. For life is affirmation itself. And this affirmation must not be the one accompanied or conditioned by a negation. Such an affirmation is relative and not at all absolute. With such an affirmation, life loses its creative originality and turns into a mechanical process, grinding forth nothing but soulless flesh and bones. To be free, life must be an absolute affirmation. Zen abhors repetition or imitation of any kind, for they kill. For the same reason, Zen never explains but only affirms. Life is a fact, and no explanation is necessary. To explain is to apologize, and why should we apologize for living? To live, is that not enough? Let us then live, let us affirm. Herein lies Zen in all its purity and in all its nudity as well. That's Suzuki from an introduction to Zen Buddhism. Now, I want to return to my critic Ivakiv, who proposes a Lacanian reading here. For Ivakiv, far from advocating a renunciation to our desires, Buddha, quote, is suggesting that staying true to our desire will yield the satisfaction of that and all desire. Whereas Lacan is less interested in what it would mean to satisfy our desire if it is once we have properly identified it. End of quote. How can this be? Ivakiv introduces here sexual difference. He interprets what Lacan calls the impossibility of the sexual relationship as the impossibility to reach the goal of the masculine phallic subject, which is to swallow, dominate entire reality. From this phallic standpoint, Buddhism, a quote, appears as a phantasmatic spectre in the West, where masculine jouissance is predominant. Buddhism at once promises and threatens with the other dark feminine jouissance. Buddhism is only conceivable in what Zizek might call the Western ideological matrix, as this testament to its very failure to be conceived. Zizek's critique of Western Buddhism, therefore, has much less to do with the teachings of the Buddha than he has made it seem, and significantly more to do with the mystical feminine jouissance it suggests, which this feminine jouissance seems to be beyond and for that reason threatening to Zizek. My answer: far from the feminine jouissance, enjoyment, to be something threatening for me, something I try to keep at a distance, the feminine jouissance is not beyond the traumatic act of sexual difference, but one of its aspects. It emerges as the immanent other side of the of the phallic domain. The very formulation, mystical feminine jouissance, is misleading. As Lacan points out, mysticism is not exclusively feminine. Apart from its feminine version, Saint Teresa, we also have its masculine version, John of the Cross, and I want especially to insist on this difference. Masculine mystical jouissance. Lacan did something interesting here. He went to actually read these mystics from early modernity, Saint Teresa versus John of the Cross, and discovered that although they seem to describe the same mystical experience, John of the Cross gives it a masculine, perverse reading. For him, mystical experience means that I identify with the gaze, the eye of the God looking at me. I am directly an object in and of the other. This is the perverse self-objectivization. But Saint Teresa, read her, I did. Saint Teresa is, in the best sense of the term, purely hysterical. Saint Teresa, if anything, goes on talking, improvises, talks too much, and so on and so on. And as such is much closer to an authentic feminine position, because Saint Teresa precisely never reaches or forever postpones this so-called mystical peace of fully swimming in the divine enjoyment. But next point, the equation of the Buddhist enlightenment with the assertion of the feminine jouissance and with mysticism is unfounded. As my friend Lorenzo Chiesa put it, Buddhism is not a version of mysticism. Buddhism is an inverted mysticism, a quote from Chiesa's manuscript. Unlike Eastern polytheisms and their stress on enjoyment, Buddhism is a religion of desire, but it organizes desire in a way that is very different from that of Judeo-Christianity. More precisely, Buddhism short-circuits all the variations of desire, as polydesire, we might add, which appear in it in a most incarnate fashion with the ultimate apprehension of the radically illusory character of all desire. End of quote. So the formula of Buddhism would thus be not the mystical one with the world, my immersion into the divine one, bringing full enjoyment, but the none with the world. I identify the void of my inexistence, the nothingness of myself, with the void of reality itself, which lacks any substantial identity. While mysticism aims at the subject's full immersion into divine jouissance, Buddhism focuses on desire as the ultimate cause of our suffering. Desire is inconsistent, it cannot ever be fulfilled, fully satisfied, because its nature is inconsistent. Since its object is illusory, the false appearance of a void, the moment of desire's fulfillment is the moment of its defeat. And Buddhism draws the radical consequence from this insight. Not only, the only way to avoid suffering is to step out of, or rather to gain distance towards the wheel of desire, to avoid attachment to any object of desire, which means to accept, not only as a theoretical statement, but also as an existential stance, that desires are illusory because all objects of desire are non-substantial, fluctuating appearances. Such an existential detachment is the only way for us to attain peace. For Lacan, to put it brutally, such a detachment is a fake. Desire is from Lacan in itself pathological. A pathological excess, a destabilization of any balanced natural order. Suzuki seems to imply that what makes a desire mortifying is its intellectualization, its submission to rational categories that reify the fluid life experience of reality into a world of fixed substantial objects. However, desire is at its basic not an effect of mechanic intellectual imprisonment. It is a deviation inscribed into life itself. In other words, if we subtract desire from life, we don't get a more balanced life, we lose life itself. To put it succinctly, Buddhism celebrates the stepping out of the wheel of desire, while Lacan celebrates the subject's very fall into this wheel. Not compromising one's desire means a radical subjective engagement in a crazy desire which throws our entire reality out of balance. I will now repeat a quote which I already used in my books to make this clear. A well-known quote from Neil Gaiman. Longer quote, but I love it. Have you ever been in love? Horrible, isn't it? It makes you so vulnerable. It opens your chest and it opens up your heart, and it means that someone can get inside you and mess you up. You build up all these defenses. You build up a whole suit of armor so that nothing can hurt you. Then one stupid person, no different from any other stupid person, wanders into your stupid life. You give them a piece of you. They didn't ask for it. They did something dumb one day, like kiss you or smile at you, and then your life isn't your own anymore. Love takes hostages. It gets inside you. It eats you out and leaves you crying in the darkness. So simple a phrase like, maybe we should be just friends, turns into a glass splinter working its way into your heart. It hurts. Not just in the imagination, not just in the mind. It's a soul hurt. A real gets inside you and rips you apart pain. I hate love. End of quote. And here is then the difference. Buddhism teaches us to relieve us of this soul hurt. Psychoanalysis compels us to fully embrace it. Or, as Lacan put it, the highest moral law is the law of desire. Now, this brings me back to what already I improvised a little bit yesterday. The difference between two main versions of Buddhism, Mahayana, the big wheel, and Theravada. Theravada returns partially to the original Hinayana Buddhism. It concerns the accessibility of nirvana, which makes the subject so-called bodhisattva, the enlightened, awakened one. In Theravada, which predominates in Tibet, encountering somebody who already is a Buddha is needed to truly make someone a bodhisattva. Any other resolution to become Buddha may easily be forgotten or abandoned during the long time ahead. Theravada thus holds that the bodhisattva path is only for a rare set of individuals and has to be transmitted through exclusive lineage. In contrast to Mahayanists who universalize the bodhisattva yana, being a bodhisattva, as a path which is open to everyone and is taught for all beings to follow. But here I think problems begin. To maintain this universality, the Mahayana tradition has to introduce a distinction between two different notions of a bodhisattva's relationship to nirvana. Nirvana, inner peace, rejoining the eternal void, and bodhisattva, again, the enlightened one. The basic goal is to become, I use the ancient term, arhat, the one who is worthy, a perfected person, the one who has gained insight into the true nature of existence and has achieved nirvana. The arhat, having freed himself from the bonds of desire, will not be reborn. While the state of an arhat is considered in the Theravada tradition to be the proper goal of Buddhism, Mahayana adds to it another level. In Mahayana, we obtain the distinction between two kinds of nirvana. The nirvana of an arhat and a superior type of nirvana called apratistita, non-abiding. This second type of nirvana allows a Buddha to remain engaged in our ordinary life, the wheel of desire, without being affected by its traps. However, the predominant Mahayana notion of bodhisattva silently concedes that to arrive at such a non-dual state, in the sense of, yes, I am in the void, but I remain fully in the reality. I just relate in a different way to the same flux of reality. They admit that this is practically impossible. So, here enters the notion of bodhisattva in its specific Mahayana meaning. Bodhisattva is somebody who heroically sacrifices they are mostly men, his own dharma, and postpones his awakening until all living beings will be liberated. Bodhisattvas take the following vow: I shall not enter into final nirvana before all beings will have been liberated. Or, I must lead all beings to liberation. I will stay here till the end, even for the sake of one's living soul. End of quote. The bodhisattva who wants to reach Buddhahood, becoming Buddha, for the sake of all beings, is more loving and compassionate than the Sravaka, he who only wishes to end his or her or its own suffering. The true bodhisattva practices the path of the good of others, par artha, while the Sravakas do so for their own good, siva artha. I find this distinction between par artha and svartha potentially very dangerous. Although Mahayana appears more democratic, allowing everyone to attain dharma, enter nirvana, thus this notion of bodhisattva who refuses to enter nirvana, does it not conceal a new form of elitism? A selected few who remain caught into our ordinary reality in the wheel of desire legitimize their special privileged position by the fact that they could have reached nirvana but postpone it to help all others to reach it. In some radical sense, nirvana thus becomes impossible, out of reach. If I reach it, I act as an egotist. I care only for my own good because I reach it alone in inner reflection. If I act for the good of others, again I postpone my entry into nirvana. I consider this privileged position dangerous because it remains caught in a dualism that authentic Buddhism promises to leave behind. The realm of nirvana becomes a beyond which we strive to reach. You can reach it but alone, and if you do this, it's a kind of paradox that your position of enunciation undermines the content. You reach nirvana, but you as you alone, which precisely asserts your ego. The danger resides in the fact that this position relies on what one could call the basic syllogism of self-sacrifice. I want all living beings to overcome their suffering and achieve the supreme good. To do this, I have to sacrifice my own happiness and accept suffering. Only in this way, my own life has meaning. Again, the danger is that a short circuit necessarily occurs here. I automatically take my own suffering as a proof that I am working for the good of others, so that I can reply to anyone who criticizes me. Can't you see my suffering? Who are you to criticize me when I sacrifice myself for you? At this point, happiness and sacrifice are no longer opposed. They fully coincide. What brings me, if I am the Mahayana type bodhisattva, who remains in this world of suffering to help others, what brings me happiness in the sense of libidinal satisfaction is the very pain of my sacrifice, which I misread as a proof that my life has a deeper meaning. This is why the only authentic nirvana means that I fully remain in this world and just relate to it differently. Non-abiding nirvana is the only full and true nirvana. So why does even this nirvana, I think, fail? Let me focus on another problem that I briefly mentioned yesterday, the dimension of inter-subjectivity, in the basic sense of collectivity, you as part of a group, humanity or other people, and so on. In her text, Relational Dharma, Janine Davis tries to develop a liberating model of inter-subjectivity. Her starting point is the basic goal of practicing Dharma, which is precisely to reach, to drown yourself in this interrelational totality. Davis, of course, has to concede that the practice of meditation is primarily focused on solitary introspective methods, where stages of insight unfold with a climate of extreme mental seclusion and interpersonal isolation. Her aim is to demonstrate how Dharma can also be achieved through new social practice of interaction. In order to deploy this claim, she engages in the opposition between, again, two main orientations of Buddhism, Mahayana and Theravada. As I already said, Theravada concentrates on achieving Dharma by means of individual practice of introspection, while Mahayana emphasizes Dharma achieved by social interaction. Say, when an individual is afflicted by a trauma which threatens to destroy his or her psychic balance and ability to interact with others, Mahayana practices the relational Dharma approach which, a quote, mediates and attunes within an environment of emphatic union, nourishing an atmosphere that assuages anxiety and facilitates the generation of trust and safety to flow in the in-between. This process allows for the possibility of transforming negative or life-diminishing filters into associations that widen and deepen identity. In this experience, the appearance of something foreign, not part of, or too much, is relaxed so that one's desire of what constitutes a whole person naturally broadens and evolves, and a deeper understanding of oneself and the relationship between oneself and others emerges. End of quote. So in such an approach, one achieves, again, quote, the inner liberty to feel another's suffering as inseparable to one's own, and the compassion to seek to alleviate it, thus respecting the freedom of others as inseparable to one's own freedom. The freedom to forgive others and their transgressions. In order to forgive, the ability to step back and recognize the conditions of that gave rise to his or her or their actions versus reacting from a place of personalizing these actions must be developed. As awareness into the causal relationship that led this individual to be wounded and act in a harmful way becomes recognized, relational objectivity emerges, and compassion becomes possible. So, I think, to cut a long story short, that nice as it may sound, this operation doesn't work. Why? Because it simply applies the notion of interrelatedness. There are no things, objects alone. It's all part of a generalized flux, to intersubjectivity. The idea is that you are evil if you extract yourself from the totality of human beings and posit yourself as an exception. You tend to dominate others, and so on. If you see the whole pattern, then obstacles to freedom do not simply vanish, but they are re-experienced as vehicles for growth and freedom. They are deprived of their substantial identity and put in their relational context in which they arise and disappear in codependence, resonating within the whole like totality. But my problem is here, it's a very naive approach, and I would like to hear an answer. And I know that some Buddhists heroically try to practice it. Imagine you are in a violent political struggle, demonstration. Police is beating you. I know of some heroic Buddhists from Myanmar, ex-Burma, the colonial term, who, when they were attacked by the police and army soldiers who tried to suppress their protest, they didn't fight back, but they heroically accepted those and addressed the soldiers like, don't you see, this is all a flux of phenomena, we are part of the same totality. If you realize this, you will see how all things that you are doing, evil things, in some mysterious way contribute to global harmony and so on and so on. Okay, you can imagine where I am aiming at something more brutal. What I was talking about yesterday. Would you say this to Himmler or to some concentration camp executioners? That we will not fight you, we prisoners in Auschwitz or wherever, we just have to re-experience you as vehicles for growth and freedom. I don't think that when we are dealing with the evil that I tried to explain yesterday, that such a stance of unearthing the relational context helps at all. I think that it's some kind of a fake, empty wisdom. It doesn't work. Why not? Now I come to my second point. Because, as I again already pointed out yesterday, because of the problem of intersubjectivity. Because intersubjectivity, from the Hegelian and Lacanian standpoint, is a cut in reality. As a subject, I extract myself from a totality, and for me, another person that I encounter is and forever remains an enigma. And Lacan uses the Italian term from some old play, che vuoi? What do you want? To recognize another person means precisely not to resolve him, her, them into the flux of phenomena, but respect them in the abyss of their uniqueness, which can also be evil. So, for Lacan, intersubjectivity is irreducibly conflictual, in the sense that if I were to be alone without intersubjectivity, but I'm not, of course, because I'm constituted through relations to others, I could say, okay, I try to dominate reality, I never succeed, and so on. But as Hegel saw it clearly, the problem is that I am a subject only through struggle, tension with other subjects. Here enters the problem of recognition. And this problem is not so easily resolved through mutual recognition. Why not? Let me improvise a brief detour through political what I call political correctness. The impression I get from many of those who see, and they are there, I admit it, traces of sexual exploitation, domination, and so on, implicitly, they talk or even act as if each of us has some kind of inner true desire, sexual desire, mode of jouissance, what you want, and this is thwarted for external reasons. Binary heterosexual logic imposed by the patriarchal order, and so on and so on. So that if we try to get rid of this external imposed ideology, then we would be able to actualize our unique desire. But as Lacan puts it, our desire is the desire of the other. Our desire is always mediated by the desires of the others. And as I developed it long ago, in at least three ways. First, my desire is the desire to be desired by others. Second, my desire is the desire of the other, of the big other, in the sense that all that I desire, even if my desire is transgressive one against the ruling ideology and so on, is nonetheless structured, emerges against the background of the predominant symbolic order. And third point, which I already mentioned, my desire for Lacan is triggered by the enigma of the other. The original question of desire is not, this is a beautiful scene reconstructed by Lacan and his pupil Jean Laplanche. The original scene of desire, if you want, is not what do I want, what do I desire, I never get what I want, is that already as a small, very small baby, I notice that I am caught in the network of the desire of the others. My parents, relatives, brother, sister, they see something in me, they want something from me. And it's never clear to me, it remains an enigma, what do they want from me? And I don't think that this enigmatic complexity can be resolved in dissolving myself, as it were, in the interrelational flow of phenomena, so that I see I'm part of a larger society, of a larger network where all phenomena are coordinated, and so on and so on. I think that there is, at least as I see it, no place in at least the Buddhism that I know, that I've read, no place for this radical notion of inter-subjectivity. Inter-subjectivity is mostly about how to overcome my egotism. But as a subject, and that was my point yesterday when I talked about Himmler, the worst dominating subjects are precisely those who do not identify with their egotism, but who are ready to sacrifice themselves, their lives, everything for the evil cause, which is their cause, for which they are precisely ready to sacrifice everything. So let me slowly approach the conclusion, first by pointing to one crucial thing. When Buddhists talk about this inner experience of withdrawing from external reality, reaching inner peace, withdrawing into yourself, the point is not that there is no such a thing. But I think that Hegel does allow for something that echoes the practice of meditation, which in Theravada Buddhism is primarily focused on solitary introspective methods where stages of insight unfold within a climate of extreme mental seclusion and interpersonal isolation. However, while in Buddhism, through such practice, the mind experiences a kind of current of quiet peace, for Hegel, introspection confronts us with an awful space in which ghastly apparitions of partial objects float around. Here is the most famous and often quoted passage of this night of the world that I quote again. The human being is this night, this empty nothing that contains everything in its simplicity, an unending wealth of many representations, images, of which none belongs to the human being, or which are not present. This night, the interior of nature that exists here in pure self, is in phantasmagorical representation, is night all around it, in which here shoots a bloody head, there another white ghastly apparition, suddenly here before it, and just so disappears. One catches sight of this night when one looks human beings into the eye, into a night that becomes awful. So you see what Hegel provides here. Also a state where all stable identities dissolve, but not in a peaceful flow, but in what Lacan would have called the experience of le corps morcelé, dismembered body, a terrifying mixture of ghastly apparitions. And this topic, now to conclude, this topic brings us back to the notion of sacrifice. We have seen what kind of sacrifice the notion of bodhisattva implies. This sacrifice remains firmly within the frame of traditional sacrifice. I choose to remain in the valley of tears, postponing my full enlightenment in order to work for the global elimination of suffering. It's like, sorry for this tasteless metaphor, let's say I am a rich guy, billionaire, but I move to a ghetto among the poor and give most of my wealth to them there to also help them, to bring them to wealth. So Buddhist enlightenment implies a self-reflexive sacrifice. You empty yourself of your desires, the pursuit of which always disappoints you, and in a way you sacrifice this sacrifice itself, because after you sacrifice your desires and their satisfaction, you realize that what you sacrificed was in itself worthless. So, an authentic, here nonetheless, let me conclude with this. The Buddhism and Lacan come very close because they both agree that an authentic sacrifice functions as a gesture of total self-renunciation. Now, the quotes are from the one who is close to Buddhism, but at the same time totally different. My favorite theologist, Søren Kierkegaard. In self-renunciation, one understands one is capable of nothing. So in theological terms, the renunciation bears witness to the total gap that separates man from God. The only way to assert one's commitment to unconditional meaning of life is to relate all of your life, your entire existence, to the absolute transcendence of the divine, and since there is no common measure between our life and the divine, the sacrificial renunciation cannot be part of an exchange with God. We sacrifice all, the totality of our life, for nothing. Quote from Kierkegaard. The contradiction which arrests the understanding is that of a man required to make the greatest possible sacrifice, to dedicate his whole life as a sacrifice, and wherefore there is indeed no wherefore, end of quote. What this means is that there is no guarantee that our sacrifice will be rewarded. that it will restitute meaning to our life. One has to make a leap of faith, which, in the eyes of an external observer, cannot but appear as an act of madness, like Abraham's readiness to kill Isaac. Even to many of my Jewish friends, this is problematic. Through my Jewish friends, I learned that some more progressive-oriented Jewish, let's call them, I don't like the term theologists, try to get rid of that moment. They claim that Isaac rebelled, that what we get is a later rewriting of the old Jewish Testament. That yes, God did ask Abraham to kill Isaac, but Abraham rejected it. That all others is, and that then God acknowledges this. Now you are my true follower. I think it's too easy this way out. Again, a quote from Kierkegaard. At first glance, the understanding ascertains that this is madness. The understanding asks, what's in it for me? The answer is nothing. So the ultimate meaning of sacrifice is therefore the sacrifice of meaning itself. Now, if you allow me just to go on a little bit to a topic which is actual today. So the only true radical opposition is the one between Buddhism for me and Lacan's formulation of psychoanalytic ethics. They are both not anti-scientific. They accept that scientific achievements cannot be reintegrated into our daily experiences. I will refer here to a German neuroscientist who put this very nicely. Thomas Metzinger claimed in his great book, Being No One, that we cannot help experiencing ourselves as selves, substantial, subjective identities. We can learn rationally that there is no self, that we are biogenetically determined self-replicating mechanisms. We can accept this at the level of abstract knowledge. But we cannot believe in it in the sense of really assuming it as a subjective experience. As I already developed years ago, there are within brain sciences themselves different versions here. The first one is this one mentioned here by Metzinger, a gap. We are, in the same way, vaguely familiar to Louis Althusser, who said there is a gap between scientific knowledge and our ideological self-experience. Our ideological self-experience is here to stay. We cannot get rid of it, but it's in some sense an illusion. So we have to live in this gap. I know scientifically that I am totally self-determined, that my freedom is a subjective illusion, but nonetheless, I cannot but experience myself as a free human being with autonomous will and so on and so on. Then there are those, like Patricia Churchland, who think that, but I don't believe it can be done, who think that they can, that people will be able to do it. That in the same way that now, when you look at the moon and see it as a small ball or even circle in the sky, we all know that moon is a large planet, that we can do something similar in our experience and act with full awareness that there is no free will. This will even make us able to construct maybe a more tolerant and so on society. Then there is the transcendental solution, which I talked about a lot in the past. The idea elaborated by neo-Hegelians like from Pippin to Robert Brandom up to Habermas and others in Germany, claiming that even when we investigate our brains in neuronal sciences and treat our brains as another natural mechanism, our very scientific activity is done in such a way that we perceive ourselves as practicing free reasoning. For example, now, if I were to be a determinist neuroscientist, I'm trying to convince you by arguments that there is no free will. Well, if there is no free will, why am I trying even to convince you? When I'm trying to convince you, I treat you minimally as a free person to be convinced by arguments. And then what comes is a fourth solution. What do I mean by this? Recall the practice of many lonely, even not so lonely individuals. My friends are among them, who, in the evenings mostly, chat extensively with a chatbot, exchanging friendly messages about new movies and books, debating political questions, and so on. No wonder that such exchanges are relaxing and satisfying. To use my old joke, what they get, my friends, is an artificial intelligence version of decaffeinated coffee or drink without sugar, a neighbor without its opaque monstrosity, an other who simply accommodates itself to my needs. But there is a lie at work here. A chatbot lies most when it openly confesses that it is just a machine. Like, I made this experiment. I asked a chatbot a week ago a simple question. Should I be a communist? And the answer I got is, listen, as an artificial intelligence language model, I do not have personal opinions or beliefs, and I cannot make decisions for you. Ultimately, the decision to adopt a particular political ideology, such as communism, is a personal one that should be based on careful consideration and evaluation of the ideology's principles, values, and potential outcomes, and so on. Why is this a lie? It is true as to its enunciated. Effectively, we are dealing with a digital machine which doesn't have opinions. But it is a lie as to its implicit position of enunciation. A chatbot talks as if it is a real person, just frankly admitting to its limitation and confessing it is not a real person. The mystification is here the opposite of the fetishist denial. The chatbot denies nothing. It's just said, I know I am not a real person. But the but is that it continues to speak, to argue as if it is a real person. But back to Metzinger. He goes here a step further. There is one caveat that he allows, precisely as you may have guessed, the Buddhist enlightenment, in which the self directly, experientially assumes his own non-being, recognizes itself as a simulated self, a representational fiction. Such a situation in which we became lucid to oneself Metzinger claims directly corresponds to the Buddhist conception of enlightenment. When I'm enlightened through meditation, Buddhist meditation, what I arrive at is no longer self-awareness. It is no longer I, myself, who experiences myself as the agent of my thoughts. My awareness is the direct awareness of a selfless system, a selfless knowledge. In short, there effectively is a link, a kind of asymptotic point of coincidence between the radical brain sciences positions and the Buddhist idea of an Atman, self, of the self's inexistence. The Buddhist subjective stance of an Atman is the only subjective stance which really assumes the result of cognitivism, of brain sciences, and which in certain versions is fully compatible with radical scientific naturalism. But it is here that we clearly see, how, although Lacan defines the Freudian subject as the subject of modern science, how this proximity only makes the gap more palpable. In Buddhism, you are taught to sacrifice desire in order to attain the inner peace of enlightenment, in which sacrifice cancels itself. You sacrifice in the course of meditation everything, but then you discover the worthlessness of what you sacrificed. For Lacan, however, that's the formula with which I want to finish, the true sacrifice is not sacrificing your desire. No, we often sacrifice our desire to make it easier for us. Desire is hell, as I try to demonstrate with that quote from Neil Gaiman. The true sacrifice is desire itself. Desire is an intrusion which throws off the rail the rhythm of my daily life. It compels me to forfeit everyday pleasures and comforts for discipline and hard work in the pursuit of the object of my desire, be it love, a political cause, science, or whatsoever. So again, with great appreciation for Buddhism, they are both aware of this radical dimension of sacrifice itself. But for Buddhism, it is sacrifice of desire. For Lacan, desire itself is already a sacrifice. You sacrifice the peace, the peaceful flow of your life for the cause object of your desire. That's the big choice to be made. Sorry if I was a little bit too long. Thanks very much.